It's an honor to be recognized for the work we all do, day in and day out.
They called her just the cleaning lady. Nobody expected her to take the stage today. At the grand charity event, the CEO was supposed to speak, but he was sick, leaving the spotlight to this quiet, unassuming woman. As she walked to the microphone, whispers rippled through the room. Who was she really? Everyone assumed she was just a humble worker, a background figure in a world of polished suits and glittering accolades. But what happened next would shock them all. Her voice, steady and filled with warmth, began to tell a story of hard work, family, and unseen sacrifices. Each word drew the audience in, leaving them hanging on every sentence. And just when they thought they had figured out who she was, the truth was revealed, a secret that no one could have imagined. By the end, the entire room would be left speechless, and hearts profoundly moved. Before we get started, I want to know, which city are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. I love seeing where each of you is tuning in from for our emotional stories. They called her just a cleaning lady. Ruth Johnson, 68 years old, had spent decades moving quietly through the grand halls of the Carter Foundation, unnoticed and underestimated. Every day, she swept floors, polished tables, and arranged flowers, her presence familiar but invisible to the executives and organizers alike. She was a black woman, wise with age and life experience, but in a room full of polished suits and glittering accolades, nobody paid her much attention. Today was different. The Carter Foundation's annual charity gala, a lavish event reserved for the wealthiest donors and most influential figures, was about to begin. Michael Carter, the CEO and public face of the foundation, was supposed to give the opening speech, but illness had forced him to stay home. In his place, the spotlight fell to Ruth, the woman everyone overlooked. Whispers rippled through the room as she adjusted her uniform, smoothing her apron and straightening her back. Who was she to speak before this elite crowd? As she walked toward the stage, each step was deliberate, measured and full of quiet dignity. Eyes followed her, some curious, some skeptical, some dismissive. "She's just the cleaning lady," murmured a few attendees. What could she possibly have to say? The organizers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether the crowd would even listen. But Ruth ignored them. Her mind focused on something far greater than appearances. The moment had finally come to share a story that had been waiting decades to be heard. Behind the scenes, Michael's office was quiet. He had spent years building the foundation, guided in no small part by Ruth's silent support. She had raised him, shaped his values, and instilled lessons of resilience, integrity, and compassion. Yet the world knew nothing of this bond. Today she would step into the light, representing all that he had learned from her, and showing the crowd that true influence and wisdom often come from the most unexpected places. The audience began to settle, murmurs fading into anticipatory silence. The lights focused on the podium, highlighting Ruth's unassuming figure. She glanced at the crowd of unfamiliar faces, some polite, some impatient, all unaware of the depth behind her quiet demeanor. Then, with a steady breath, she reached the microphone. The room went silent, hanging on her first words. Soft yet commanding, her voice carried the weight of decades of unseen labor, love, and guidance. Little did anyone suspect, the speech that would follow was more than words. It was a revelation. By the end, hearts would be moved, assumptions shattered, and every person in that room would recognize that Ruth Johnson, the invisible cleaning lady, was far more than they ever imagined. She was a mother, a mentor, a hero, and today she would finally take her rightful place in the spotlight. The charity gala setting. The Carter Foundation's annual charity gala was no ordinary gathering. It was the kind of event where the chandeliers sparkled so brightly they seemed to compete with the diamonds draped around the guests' necks. The ballroom of the Grand Regency Hotel pulsed with quiet luxury. Crystal glasses chimed, violins played softly in the corner, and waiters in pressed white jackets glided through the room carrying trays of champagne. The air smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume. This was not a place for ordinary people. It was an arena reserved for the city's elite, bankers, senators, CEOs, and socialites whose names appeared regularly in the society columns. They mingled with polite laughter, discussing investment portfolios, politics, and vacations on private islands, barely noticing the staff moving silently around them. For these guests, charity galas were less about compassion and more about being seen, photographed, and remembered. The Carter Foundation had grown into one of the most respected philanthropic institutions in the state, and tonight's fundraiser was its crown jewel. Millions of dollars were expected to be pledged, money that would go towards scholarships, hospitals, and community centers. Everyone knew that Michael Carter, the foundation's young and charismatic CEO, was the star of the evening. His speeches were legendary, his presence magnetic. People came as much to witness his brilliance as to support the cause. But behind the glittering facade, there was a tension, a small but noticeable stir. Whispers began to move across the room. "Michael's not here. What do you mean he's ill?" The announcement that the CEO was unable to attend had rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Who would take his place? Eyes darted toward the stage, where the podium stood tall, decorated with white lilies, and bearing the Carter Foundation emblem. Donors checked their watches. Some frowned, others smirked, curious to see how the organization would handle such a disruption. Meanwhile, Ruth Johnson moved silently along the edges of the ballroom, adjusting chairs, polishing a forgotten glass, straightening a napkin. She had done this for years, invisible to the very people now waiting in restless anticipation. Yet fate was quietly weaving a new thread into the fabric of this evening. The gala, with all its wealth and power, was about to witness something no one could have predicted. The quiet voice of a woman who had been there all along, unseen, overlooked, yet holding a story that could shake the room to its core. The expectation of the CEO's speech for years, the highlight of the Carter Foundation's gala, had been the moment when Michael Carter himself took the stage. At just 45, he had already become a symbol of modern philanthropy, a polished speaker with the kind of charisma that could make even the wealthiest donors loosen their wallets. His words were not just speeches, they were performances, carefully woven with stories of resilience, hope, and progress. Many guests admitted, sometimes in hushed tones, that they donated more after hearing him speak than they originally planned. So when word spread that Michael would not be delivering the keynote address that evening, a hush of disbelief fell over the tables. Champagne glasses hovered mid-air. Conversations faltered. "Michael's speeches are the best part of these galas," one woman whispered to her husband, her diamond earrings catching the golden light of the chandeliers. "Without him, what's the point?" A banker in a sharp navy suit leaned toward his colleagues. "I flew in from New York just for this. If he's not here, then who's going to inspire us? Surely not one of the board members. They don't have the same spark." Even the reporters seated discreetly in the back adjusted their cameras and whispered among themselves. The Carter Foundation had become synonymous with Michael Carter. To see the event unfold without his commanding presence felt almost unthinkable. At the center table, a few of the older donors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They remembered Michael's humble beginnings, how he had turned his family's struggles into a mission to uplift communities. They weren't just here for the cocktails and glittering lights. They wanted to hear him remind them of why their millions mattered. But as the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere shifted from polite anticipation to restless curiosity. The podium stood empty, its microphone gleaming under the spotlights, waiting. Who would step forward? Which voice would carry the weight of the foundation's reputation tonight? A foundation director finally approached the stage, his smile tight, his posture slightly rigid. He tapped the microphone, and the room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but lacking the magnetism everyone expected. "Unfortunately, due to illness, Mr. Michael Carter will not be joining us this evening. He sends his warmest regards and deepest gratitude for your presence and generosity." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. The disappointment was palpable. For some, the gala had already lost its magic. But then the director cleared his throat, glanced toward the back of the room, and said words that left the audience blinking in surprise. "In his absence, we have asked someone very dear to the foundation to share a few words with you tonight. Please welcome Ms. Ruth Johnson." Gasps, whispers, even chuckles spread like wildfire. Ruth Johnson, the cleaning lady. Surely this was a mistake. The news that Michael cannot attend. The director's words lingered in the air like an unexpected draft. "Mr. Michael Carter will not be joining us this evening." For a moment, the ballroom remained still, almost frozen, as if no one had truly processed what had been said. Then came the murmurs, soft at first, like a low hum, then louder, swelling into a wave of disbelief that rolled across the golden-lit hall. "Not here. Michael." A silver-haired woman clutched her pearl necklace as though she'd just been told royalty would not arrive. "But he never misses the gala. This can't be serious." A senator, adjusting his cufflinks impatiently, muttered to his aide, These events don't run themselves. Carter is the foundation. Without him, this evening is, what? A dinner with overpriced wine. Laughter, short, dismissive, broke out at a corner table. A group of young tech entrepreneurs, invited as potential donors, shook their heads. Unbelievable, one of them whispered. I came to hear the man speak, not to sit through filler. At the press table, journalists exchanged glances, some already scribbling notes. Carter absent from his own gala. The headline practically wrote itself. They could almost feel the story slipping away, drained of the emotional climax they had expected. And yet, behind the irritation and disappointment, there was something else. Unease. Michael Carter's speeches were more than eloquent. They were the soul of the foundation. Without him, who could hold the crowd together? The director continued, his polite smile faltering as he faced the sea of restless expressions. Mr. Carter has taken ill. He is deeply regretful, but he insisted that tonight must go on. The guests leaned back in their chairs, some crossing their arms, others already signaling for another drink. The string quartet in the corner played softly, but even their elegant notes seemed swallowed by the growing tension. A man at the back whispered just loud enough for others to hear, "What's next, the janitor giving us the keynote?" The remark earned a few stifled chuckles, though several guests looked around nervously, as if the very idea was insulting the prestige of the evening. Meanwhile, near the service doors, Ruth Johnson straightened the napkin she had been folding, her face calm, but her heart beginning to pound. She had heard the director's words too. And though she had been invisible to these guests for nearly 3 decades, tonight, invisibility would no longer be an option. The murmurs thickened, an air of impatience settling like a fog. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted reassurance. But the truth was, the Carter Foundation had just set the stage for something far more memorable than anyone in that room could imagine. The cleaner is called to the stage. The crowd inside the grand ballroom was restless. The air carried that strange mix of impatience and curiosity. They had just been told that Michael, the young and brilliant CEO everyone had come to hear, would not be able to attend. A murmur ran through the tables like a ripple in water. Some were disappointed. Others whispered in annoyance. After all, these were people used to things going exactly as planned. Suddenly the host cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, visibly uncomfortable, "in Michael's absence we have someone who has agreed to step forward tonight. She may not be who you expected, but she has something important to share." There was a dramatic pause. All eyes turned to the side of the stage as the spotlight shifted, and there she was, Margaret Johnson, the 68-year-old cleaning lady who had worked in that very building for years, standing awkwardly by the steps. The silence was deafening. A few polite laughs slipped out from one corner of the room, as if this were some elaborate joke. Others frowned, confused. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering, "What is this? A cleaner? Is this serious?" Margaret, dressed in her simple work uniform, clutched the edges of her hands nervously. Her posture carried both humility and quiet dignity. For a second, even she couldn't believe what was happening. She had only been asked moments ago, behind the scenes, if she would be willing to say a few words. And now, here she was, standing in front of the city's wealthiest elite, the chandeliers casting golden light over faces full of skepticism. The host gestured toward her. "Please, welcome Mrs. Johnson." A few claps rang out, scattered and hesitant, more out of politeness than genuine enthusiasm. Margaret walked slowly to the podium, her old shoes echoing faintly against the polished floor. Her heart was pounding, but there was also a calm strength in her eyes. The audience wasn't expecting inspiration. They weren't expecting wisdom. They weren't expecting anything at all. Yet something about the way Margaret looked at them, with a mixture of resilience, grace, and a hint of sorrow, began to silence even the whispers. The stage was set. The invisible woman was now in the spotlight. The audience's initial reactions, disdain, chuckles. As Margaret adjusted the microphone with shaky hands, a wave of unease washed over the ballroom. The audience, draped in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, exchanged looks that needed no words. Raised eyebrows, muffled laughs, and smirks spread across the tables like wildfire. One man at the front whispered too loudly to his companion, "Is this a joke? They brought the janitor to replace the CEO?" His companion chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass as if the entire moment was nothing more than free entertainment. At another table, 2 women leaned close, covering their lips with jeweled hands. "I've seen her in the hallways," one murmured. "She empties the trash bins." The other responded with a stifled giggle, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier's light. The disdain was thick in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Margaret could feel it. The sound of chairs shifting uncomfortably, the rustle of expensive fabrics, the low hum of whispers bouncing from one corner of the room to another. It was the sound of judgment. And yet, amidst the cynicism, there were other reactions too. A few younger faces in the crowd looked more curious than mocking, their eyes wide as if silently asking, "Why her?" But they were drowned out by the audible sighs and quiet scoffs of the majority. Margaret's heart pounded. She wasn't naive. She knew what they saw when they looked at her. To them, she was invisible. A 68-year-old black woman in a faded cleaning uniform, someone who belonged in the shadows, not under the spotlight. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling at first. "Good evening," she said softly. The microphone amplified her words, but it couldn't drown out the wave of chuckles that rolled across the room. A man in the back even clapped twice in mock applause, earning a few laughs from his table. The humiliation stung, but Margaret didn't lower her eyes. Instead, she paused, gripping the sides of the podium tighter. The pause was long enough that the laughter began to die down. There was something in her silence, a quiet resilience like a storm gathering strength. Even those mocking her began to shift uneasily, sensing that perhaps this moment was not as ridiculous as they wanted to believe. Still, the first impression had been made. To most in the room, Margaret was out of place. A cleaner on stage in front of the city's wealthiest elite. It was absurd. And yet, sometimes the most absurd beginnings carry the most powerful endings. Ruth prepares to take the stage. Backstage, Ruth's hands trembled as she smoothed down the front of her faded uniform. The deep navy fabric, worn thin at the elbows, stood in sharp contrast to the glittering gowns and tuxedos shimmering under the chandeliers. She had never felt more out of place. A staff member, a young man in a crisp black suit, approached her with an apologetic look. "Mrs. Ruth, they've asked if you could say a few words in Mr. Michael's absence. Just a few minutes." "Nothing complicated." She blinked at him, stunned. "Me? You must be mistaken. I'm just the cleaner." But the young man shook his head nervously. "They insisted. The crowd is waiting. We need someone to fill the silence." Her stomach tightened. For 68 years, Ruth had learned to live in the background, to be present but unseen, to move quietly through offices and boardrooms, sweeping floors while powerful men made decisions that shaped lives. And now, in the twilight of her years, she was being asked to step into their world, not as a shadow but as a voice. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. A swirl of memories came rushing back. The long nights scrubbing hospital floors when her son was sick, the years of double shifts to put food on the table, the countless times she was overlooked or dismissed. Every wrinkle on her face carried the weight of survival, of dignity preserved in silence. And yet there was also pride. Pride in the son she had raised, the man who had climbed higher than she ever dreamed. Tonight he wasn't here to stand tall, but she could, for him. Her palms were clammy, her knees unsteady. She whispered under her breath, almost like a prayer, "Lord, give me strength. Don't let me fall apart in front of them." The muffled sound of the audience reached her ears. Laughter, murmurs, the clinking of glasses. She knew what awaited her out there. Judgment, ridicule, disbelief. But she also knew something they didn't, something that gave her courage. Straightening her back, Ruth took one last breath and adjusted her simple silver cross necklace, the one she'd worn since her youth. It rested against her chest like an anchor, steadying her. The curtain shifted. A spotlight warmed her face. It was time. And though her heart hammered in her chest, Ruth stepped forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, yet filled with a quiet determination. The cleaner was about to stand where only power usually spoke. The weight of her life story, subtle flashbacks. The microphone crackled softly as Ruth leaned in. Her voice, at first, was a whisper lost among the murmurs of the audience. "Good evening." A few polite coughs scattered through the crowd, but no true silence followed. People still shifted in their seats, whispering behind manicured hands. To them, she was nothing more than a last-minute stand-in, a cleaner filling time until someone important took charge again. Ruth tightened her grip on the podium, her knuckles pale against the wood. She steadied her breath. Then she spoke again, stronger this time. "My name is Ruth, and I've spent the better part of my life cleaning halls, offices, and rooms just like this one." That drew a few smirks from the back rows. A man in a designer suit leaned toward his wife and chuckled. But Ruth didn't waver. Instead, her eyes drifted upward to the glittering chandeliers. Flashback. A younger Ruth pushing a mop across a hospital floor, her shoes soaked, her back aching, but her little boy waiting at home with a fever. She worked through the night, whispering prayers under buzzing fluorescent lights. "I started working when I was just a girl," she continued, her voice carrying more weight. "Scrubbing kitchens, polishing floors, sometimes working 3 jobs just to make sure there was food on the table." Flashback, Ruth, barely 20, sitting at a diner counter, counting pennies with trembling hands, while a baby stroller rested beside her. Every coin mattered. Every shift was survival. Her throat tightened, but she pressed forward. Some people see a cleaner and think of someone invisible, someone with no voice. But let me tell you, you learn a lot about people when you're the one cleaning up after them. A hush began to settle, slowly replacing the giggles. Flashback, Ruth, now middle-aged, polishing a long mahogany boardroom table late at night. Through the glass walls, she could see executives celebrating a big deal. She had been the one to set their chairs, refill their glasses, yet none of them knew her name. She returned to the present moment, her gaze firm now. "I've seen pride, I've seen arrogance, I've seen kindness too, though it's rare. And through all those years I learned something simple. Dignity doesn't come from titles, it comes from how you treat people." For the first time, the ballroom was silent. Not a glass clinked, not a whisper stirred. And standing under the spotlight, Ruth felt the weight of her entire life. The years of invisibility, the sacrifices, the quiet strength crystallize into each word she spoke. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were no longer watching a cleaner. They were listening to a woman whose story carried more power than any speech they had expected to hear that night. First words at the microphone, a gentle, disbelieved voice. The spotlight felt like a burden on Ruth's shoulders as she adjusted the microphone. For a brief moment her hand trembled, not from fear of the crowd, but from the weight of decades suddenly converging in this moment. She cleared her throat softly, the sound almost swallowed by the cavernous ballroom. "Good evening," she began, her voice carrying the fragile gentleness of someone unused to commanding attention. Scattered coughs and faint laughter rippled across the audience. A few heads turned, eyebrows raised in disbelief. Was this really happening? A cleaning lady standing at the podium where only polished CEOs and dignitaries had spoken before? Ruth continued, her tone steady but quiet. "I know I'm not the person you expected to hear tonight. In fact, I'm probably the last person you imagined would stand on this stage." The words hung awkwardly in the air. A woman in the front row gave a tight, forced smile, as though indulging a child. Someone at the back muttered something under their breath, and a short laugh followed. Ruth swallowed, her gaze dropping to the notes Michael had left on the podium, neat typed lines of corporate promises and financial forecasts. She folded the paper once, then twice, and set it aside. Those weren't her words. Her voice softened further, but there was a quiet steel beneath it now. "I don't have charts or statistics for you tonight. What I do have is a story." A few in the audience exchanged glances, their amusement mingling with confusion. A story from her. Ruth's eyes swept across the room, catching the faces of men in sharp tuxedos and women draped in pearls. For decades she had dusted chandeliers like these, polished floors just as shiny, emptied trash bins from rooms just like this one, always unseen, always unheard, and yet, here she was. Her tone grew a little firmer, though still unassuming. "I was asked to speak because circumstances changed, and maybe, just maybe, there's a reason for that. So I ask you to listen, not to the position I hold, but to the life I've lived." The room shifted uneasily. Whispered conversations faltered. Somewhere in the silence, an elderly gentleman adjusted his glasses, curiosity flickering in his eyes. For the first time, the audience wasn't quite sure whether to laugh or lean in closer. Ruth clasped her hands in front of her, steady now, because sometimes wisdom doesn't wear a suit, sometimes it wears an apron. The words cut through the room like a quiet bell, not loud, not boastful, but undeniable, and for the very first time, the laughter stopped. The restless audience, whispers, exits, unease. At first, Ruth's words seemed to drift into a storm of disbelief. The chandeliers sparkled above, but the room felt dimmed by the undercurrent of murmurs. Some guests shifted in their seats, impatient. Others leaned toward one another, whispering with bemused smirks. A man near the back, tall with a silver tie pin, chuckled audibly and shook his head. "What is this?" he muttered to his companion. "A charity event or amateur night?" His companion snorted, clearly entertained by his cynicism. Closer to the front, a young woman in a sequined dress picked up her phone discreetly, scrolling as though Ruth's voice was background noise. She wasn't the only one. A ripple of glowing screens lit up across the room, small islands of distraction. The first to leave were two men in expensive suits, exchanging glances before quietly slipping out through the side doors. Their departure was followed by another, a woman who clutched her clutch tightly and walked briskly, heels clicking against the marble. Each exit was like a silent statement. This is not worth my time. But Ruth did not falter. She noticed, yes, the rustle of movement, the shifting energy, the dismissal, yet her eyes stayed fixed on the microphone, her hands resting calmly against the podium. She had lived through far worse than indifference. The whispers grew bolder. She's wasting our evening. Why would they let her speak? Where's the board? This is embarrassing. A man at one of the central tables cleared his throat loudly, perhaps as a signal of impatience. Another adjusted his cufflinks with exaggerated flair, as though eager for the ordeal to end. Still, not everyone turned away. Scattered in the crowd were a handful of listeners whose expressions had softened. An older woman in the second row tilted her head, studying Ruth not with disdain but with curiosity. A young waiter paused at the edge of the room with a tray of empty glasses, leaned slightly closer, his eyes fixed on the stage. The duality of the room was striking, half resistance, half awakening. For every sigh of boredom there was a hush of intrigue. For every exit, a silence deeper than before. Ruth took another slow breath, letting the unease settle. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, overlooked, ignored. Their restlessness didn't shake her, it fueled her. Each dismissive glance was a mirror of the thousands she had endured scrubbing floors at dawn, and so, though the ballroom stirred with disquiet, Ruth steadied her voice, letting it rise just a touch. Not demanding attention, but claiming it. Little by little, the murmurs began to compete with something else, a tension, a curiosity, a whisper of maybe there's more here than we thought. The exit slowed, the whispers softened, and in that fragile balance, Ruth prepared to take them further into her story. Ruth speaks of sacrifice and family. Ruth's voice grew steadier, carrying a quiet gravity that began to command attention. I have spent my life serving others, she said softly, yet with undeniable strength. Not because anyone asked me to, but because it was the only way I knew how to love my family. A few faces in the audience stiffened. They were used to speeches about success, wealth, or achievements. This was different. This was raw, real. She paused, letting the words sink in. When my son was little, I worked 3 jobs just to make sure he never went to bed hungry. I scrubbed floors in hospitals while he battled fevers at home. I walked the streets after long nights, exhausted, knowing that every penny I earned kept him safe. Flashback, a dimly lit kitchen, young Ruth counting coins beside a worn crib. Her son, Michael, bundled in blankets, sleeping soundly. The aroma of coffee brewing fills the room. She presses a hand to her chest, whispering a prayer, eyes tired but determined. Ruth's gaze lifted to the audience, meeting theirs slowly, deliberately. Sacrifice is not glamorous. It is not applauded. Most never see it, but it is the foundation of every life worth living. Some in the crowd leaned forward slightly, the first hints of real attention showing. They sensed the weight behind her words, even if they weren't ready to admit it. And family, she continued, her tone softening, almost tender. Family is why we endure, why we fight when we are tired, when the world sees us as invisible. I learned early that protecting those you love often goes unnoticed. But the love we give, the care we show, it shapes them. It shapes the world even if no one applauds it. Flashback, Ruth walking her son to school hand in hand, rain pelting down, her coat threadbare, shoes soaked. Yet she smiles, encouraging him. Each step a lesson in perseverance and dignity. Her voice carried a quiet authority now. I did not have titles or power. I did not have wealth, but I had responsibility, and I had love. And sometimes, that is enough to move mountains. The hush settled over the room. The previous murmurs, the quiet scoffs, the restless shuffling, all faded into a silence charged with emotion. Ruth's eyes glimmered with memories of decades spent in unseen labor, sacrifices made in the shadows, and victories known only to her family. Tonight, she said, I stand here not because I seek praise, but because I carry with me the lessons of every day I gave to those I loved most. Sacrifice is not weakness. Sacrifice is power. And family is everything. The audience sat stunned. some leaning forward, some wiping tears they didn't expect. They were beginning to understand. This was not just a speech. This was a life lived fully, a story of resilience, of love, and of quiet heroism. Flashback, young black mother, raising her son alone. The microphone carried Ruth's soft voice, but now her words conjured images far beyond the glittering ballroom. "I was just a young mother," she began, her eyes distant, seeing the past as clearly as the stage before her. "I didn't have much, but I had a child who depended on me, and I promised myself I would never let him go hungry, never let him feel unloved." Flashback. The year was decades ago, a small apartment with peeling paint, a single lamp illuminating a worn crib. Young Ruth, barely 20, rocks her infant son with a tenderness that belied the exhaustion in her eyes. Every night she counts coins to buy diapers. Every morning she rises before dawn to begin a long day of work. She scrubs floors, washes dishes, mops hallways, every task done to ensure her child's survival. "You see," Ruth continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "raising him alone meant making choices I never wanted to make. I sacrificed sleep, I sacrificed comfort, I sacrificed myself, all for him." Flashback. Ruth at a laundromat, folding clothes with meticulous care while keeping an eye on her sleeping son in a stroller. She hums softly, teaching him music and language through her lullabies, instilling in him lessons of patience, dignity, and perseverance. The struggles were relentless. There were days when the bills piled high, when food was scarce, and the world seemed too heavy for her young shoulders. She remembers sitting on the kitchen floor, cradling her son, and whispering promises she hoped she could keep. "I will make a life for you. I will make a future for you, no matter what it takes." And she did. Every exhaustion-filled shift, every skipped meal, every lonely night carried her forward. She became a master of resilience, teaching her son through actions rather than words what it meant to persevere. "Some nights," Ruth said aloud, now back in the ballroom, "I cried silently in the dark, but I never let him see those tears, because he needed strength, and if I could not provide it, then who would?" Flashback. Ruth walking through crowded streets after her late-night job, son bundled tightly against the chill. A neighbor's disdainful glance meets her, but she does not falter. She moves forward, every step a testament to determination and love. Now standing on the stage, Ruth's story no longer felt distant. It flowed through her voice like a river, carrying decades of sacrifice, resilience, and unconditional love. She wasn't just speaking of herself. She was embodying every mother who had struggled, every parent who had fought invisibly for their children, every person whose life had been shaped by quiet heroism. The audience, once mocking, now felt the weight of her journey. Every whispered laugh had vanished, replaced by attentive silence, the kind that trembles with empathy and respect. Ruth's past was alive in her words, and for the first time, the room was listening not just to a speech, but to a life. And once you finish watching this story, don't miss another amazing one. For years, police humiliated a black father, not knowing he was a Supreme Court judge. You can find the link in the cards and in the description below. It's a story you won't want to miss. The prejudice she faced throughout her life. Ruth's voice grew firmer, carrying a quiet fire beneath her calm exterior. "I have lived a long life," she said, "and in all those years, I've learned something very clear. Not everyone will see your worth. Sometimes the world will look at you and decide who you are before you've spoken a word." A few eyes in the audience narrowed. They were no longer mocking, but the weight of her words began to press on them, subtle, yet undeniable. "I faced prejudice before I even understood what it was," Ruth continued. "People judged me because of the color of my skin, because I was a woman trying to survive in a world that didn't always welcome either." Flashback. A young Ruth standing outside a crowded diner, rejected from a job she was perfectly qualified for. The manager's words lingered. "We don't hire people like you." She swallowed the sting, nodded politely, and walked away, determined to find another way. "Later," she said, her tone steady, "I was overlooked for promotions, ignored in meetings, and underestimated by those who believed titles or degrees defined ability. I cleaned offices while the very people who profited from my work assumed I had no voice, no influence, no story to tell." Flashback. Ruth at a corporate hallway, polishing the marble floor, overhearing executives dismiss a project she had subtly kept afloat behind the scenes. She had the knowledge, the skill, the foresight, yet none of it mattered until it served their convenience. "Prejudice is like a shadow," she said softly. "It follows you, even in places you think are safe. It whispers that your efforts are small, that your voice doesn't count, that your dreams are beyond reach. Ruth paused, letting the room feel the weight of her words. Every smile that had once mocked her, every whisper that had doubted her, every skeptical glance from strangers who assumed they knew her story, it all seemed to echo in the ballroom. "But I learned something else," she continued, her voice rising just enough to fill the silence. "Prejudice does not define who you are. It cannot take away the love you give, the sacrifices you make, or the lives you touch. It can only test your resilience. And if you are strong enough to endure, it will eventually reveal the truth that no one can hide forever." Flashback. Ruth walking her son to school, braving jeers from neighbors, enduring sneers from strangers on the street. She kept her chin high, her steps measured, teaching her son the power of dignity and integrity in the face of bias. The audience remained quiet now. Some faces were contemplative, others tense. The laughter, the rustling, the whispered scoffs had vanished completely. Ruth had commanded the room, not with wealth, not with position, but with the undeniable authority of experience and moral courage. Her story of prejudice, of battles fought silently, of resilience forged in hardship, had transformed the mood. The room no longer saw a 68-year-old cleaning woman. They were beginning to see Ruth, a lifetime of strength, dignity, and wisdom, ready to reveal a truth that would leave them stunned. How she worked tirelessly to support her son. Ruth's hands rested firmly on the podium as she continued, her voice steady yet full of emotion. "I worked every day, sometimes 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to make sure my son had a chance. Every dollar I earned went into his future. Every moment of exhaustion was a step toward giving him something I never had: security, opportunity, hope." She paused, letting the words linger in the ballroom. Some guests shifted in their seats, now fully attentive. They weren't listening to a cleaner. They were listening to a mother who had built a life of sacrifice brick by brick. Flashback. Ruth in the small kitchen of their apartment, pots bubbling on the stove while she simultaneously mended a tear in her son's shirt. Her hands were raw from work, but her eyes never left the boy who giggled at a simple game of counting pennies. Every chore, every scrubbed floor, every hour spent on her feet was a promise kept, that he would not lack, that he would rise above their circumstances. "I woke before dawn, pushed through aches and fatigue, and worked past exhaustion," she said, her voice growing firm. "I scrubbed floors, polished tables, cleaned offices that were never mine to hold, but every floor polished, every desk dusted, every unseen effort, it was for him, for Michael." Flashback. Ruth rushing from one job to another, balancing laundry bags, a baby carrier, and the weight of responsibilities that could crush the unprepared. Rain soaked through her coat, her shoes worn thin, yet she carried her son home with the same determination she carried in her heart every day. She smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and sorrow. "I didn't need recognition. I didn't need praise. I just needed to make sure he had every chance to succeed that I never did. And he did. He became everything I dreamed he could be." The audience began to sit straighter, sensing the magnitude of her life's devotion. Whispers had stopped. Eyes were fixed, some glistening. Ruth's words painted a portrait of quiet heroism that no fancy gala, no glittering chandelier could ever match. Flashback. Ruth staying awake late into the night, working overtime in a dimly lit office, counting paychecks, budgeting coins, planning for tuition and small victories. Her son slept nearby, unaware of the sacrifices made to keep his dreams alive. Every scraped knee, every childhood worry, every joy, all intertwined with her unwavering determination. "And so," Ruth said softly, "I worked, I endured, I gave everything I had because I believed in him, because love is work, and sacrifice is proof of it. And in those long, quiet years, I watched him grow. I watched him become a man who could stand tall, who could change lives, who could make the world take notice." By now, the audience was captivated. They could see it. The 68-year-old woman, humble and unassuming, had spent a lifetime shaping a legacy through love and labor. Every word carried weight. Every pause drew attention. Ruth's story was no longer background noise. It was the center of the evening, impossible to ignore. The values she taught, resilience, compassion. Ruth's voice softened, but there was a quiet authority in every syllable. "I didn't just work to give my son food or a roof," she said. "I worked to teach him something far more important: how to live with integrity, how to carry himself with resilience, how to show compassion even when the world offers none." Flashback. Ruth kneeling beside a scraped knee, wiping away tears and whispering, "Pain will come, but how you face it matters. Stand tall even when it hurts." She had lived that lesson daily, every early morning, every late night, every task she completed unnoticed. "You see," Ruth continued, "life does not hand you victories just because you deserve them. Life challenges you, it tests you, and it forces you to rise above setbacks, and that is resilience, that is courage." Flashback. Young Michael watching his mother calmly handle a difficult customer at the diner, her voice polite but firm, her dignity intact. He learned that strength was quiet and power could be gentle. "And compassion," Ruth said, leaning slightly forward, "is not a luxury. It is a responsibility. It's understanding that everyone carries their own burdens, and a simple act of kindness can ripple farther than you imagine. I showed him that by helping others, even when it was inconvenient, even when no one would notice, we shaped the kind of world we want to live in." Flashback. Ruth handing a warm meal to a neighbor down on his luck, smiling through fatigue, refusing acknowledgement. Michael watched, learning that humility and empathy were as important as ambition. Ruth paused, letting the room absorb the weight of her words. "These are the lessons I try to teach every day. Resilience when the world tells you no, compassion when it's easier to look away, honesty when deceit surrounds you, courage when fear threatens to silence you." Her gaze swept the audience. Some sat motionless, eyes wide, as if realizing the depth behind her humble exterior. Others pressed their hands together, holding back emotion they hadn't anticipated. "Michael," she said softly, almost as if speaking to the air itself, learned these lessons. He carried them forward, shaping his path, guiding his choices, and becoming the man he is today, not just because of intelligence or opportunity, but because he understood what truly matters in life. Flashback. Michael, young and unsure, watching his mother quietly confront an injustice at work. Her calm resolve, her unwavering morals, her empathy, all etched into his mind. He would never forget that example. "And so," Ruth concluded, voice steady and warm, "every floor I cleaned, every hour I worked, every sacrifice I made, was for more than survival. It was for teaching him how to live, and I believe, if I have done my job well, the world will be better for it." By now the room was completely silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a whisper. Every person in the audience understood. Ruth was more than a speaker. She was a vessel of life lessons, decades of hard-earned wisdom and moral truth, and the story was far from over. Her connection to the foundation since the beginning. Ruth took a slow breath, letting the silence in the ballroom settle around her like a soft cloak. "I have been a part of this foundation since its very beginning," she began. Her voice carried a quiet pride, almost humble, yet commanding in its sincerity. "Long before it became a gala, before the lights, the speeches, or the names on the invitations, I was here. I built it with my hands, my heart, and every ounce of determination I had." Flashback. Decades earlier, Ruth, a young woman with calloused hands, but a determined heart, sorting through donated goods in a small, cramped office. She drafted letters, organized drives, and convinced others to contribute, even when the world doubted her abilities. Every small act she performed laid the foundation for something far larger than herself. "I worked behind the scenes," she continued, "because no one noticed, no one gave me credit, but someone had to do it. Every person who benefited from this foundation owes their start to countless hours of invisible labor, labor I accepted gladly because the mission was worth it." Flashback. Ruth helping a family in need, walking through rundown neighborhoods, delivering meals and supplies personally. She knew the importance of seeing the impact of her work firsthand, of connecting with the people this foundation existed to help. Her eyes swept the audience now, each word drawing them further in. "I didn't do it for recognition. I didn't do it for accolades. I did it because I believed in the purpose and because I believed in giving my son a life where compassion and service mattered more than wealth or title." Flashback. Michael, a boy of 10, sitting beside his mother at a small community event, handing out plates of food under the hot sun. Ruth encouraged him gently, teaching him that leadership isn't about the spotlight, it's about action and impact. Every small role he observed his mother play shaped his understanding of responsibility and care. "And tonight," Ruth said softly, "I stand here because I could not let Michael miss this. He could not be here due to illness, and the foundation still needed a voice. I was the only one who knew its history from the very beginning, the only one who understood every sacrifice, every challenge, every victory that brought us here. The audience shifted, some leaning forward as if trying to absorb the magnitude of her statement. Ruth's connection to the foundation was no longer abstract. It was personal, tangible, undeniable. She had been the heart and soul behind the scenes, shaping lives silently for decades. And so, she concluded, when the foundation needed someone to speak tonight, someone to represent the purpose, the mission, and the love that built it, they called me. Not because of a title, not because of wealth, but because of a lifetime of dedication and love for the work and for the people it serves. By now, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The previous skepticism, the restlessness, the whispers, all had dissipated. The audience could feel the weight of Ruth's lifetime of service. Every person present was now waiting, silently anticipating the story that was about to reach its pinnacle. The turning point. Ruth speaks of a young boy who became someone special. Ruth paused, letting her eyes sweep over the room. The audience, captivated by her story of sacrifice and perseverance, leaned in instinctively, sensing that something significant was coming. She took a gentle breath, her voice lowering as if sharing a secret with each listener individually. "There was a young boy," Ruth began, her voice soft but charged with emotion, "who I watched grow up day by day, learning about life through lessons of love, hard work, and integrity. He was quiet at times, thoughtful, always observing. I remember watching him play, seeing him care for others and thinking, this child will become someone remarkable." Flashback. A sunny afternoon in a small neighborhood park. Young Michael, perhaps 8 or 9, helps another child who has fallen, gently brushing off dirt from scraped knees. Ruth stands a few steps away, smiling quietly, tears threatening to fall. She sees his kindness, his curiosity, and the beginnings of leadership in the way he interacts with others. "Life tested him," Ruth continued, "and he didn't just endure, he thrived. He faced challenges I could barely protect him from, yet he carried himself with dignity. Every lesson, every act of compassion, every bit of resilience I tried to teach him, he absorbed it and transformed it into something extraordinary." Flashback. Late nights at the small apartment. Michael, hunched over homework, while Ruth folds laundry beside him, singing softly to keep him company. She encouraged him to dream, to work hard, and to never underestimate the power of doing good for others. Her guidance was subtle, but it left an indelible mark. The audience began to stir, sensing a connection forming. The story was no longer about Ruth alone. It was about someone they were beginning to recognize as larger than life, even if they didn't yet know who he was. "He became more than I could have imagined," Ruth said, a hint of pride breaking through her gentle tone. "He grew into a man of character, of vision, of courage, a man who could take the lessons of his childhood and shape them into achievements that touched lives far beyond what I could ever have dreamed." Flashback. Michael, a young adult, speaking at a local event, confident yet humble. Ruth watches from the back unseen, her heart swelling with pride. She remembers thinking, "This boy, my boy, will change the world." Ruth's eyes glimmered as she looked around the room. "And tonight," she whispered, her tone soft but carrying weight, "I have the honor of speaking on his behalf to share what I have seen, what I have taught, and what I know, that greatness often begins in the quietest, humblest places, nurtured by unseen hands and endless love." The room was silent now, every attendee hanging on her words. There was a shift in energy, a tension building, a collective anticipation for the revelation that would transform their understanding of the entire evening. Ruth's story, once personal and private, had become universal. And the moment of truth, the moment when the audience would learn the extraordinary connection between this young boy and herself, was nearly upon them. The suspense builds. Who is this boy? Ruth let the silence stretch for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the room. Every eye was fixed on her, every ear hung on her words. The glittering chandeliers reflected the anticipation in the audience, each person sensing that the story was about to shift from remarkable to extraordinary. "This young boy," Ruth said slowly, "was not born into privilege. He did not have titles handed to him or doors opened without effort. He faced challenges that could have broken many, but not him. I watched him grow step by step, learning the values of compassion, resilience, and integrity, and I knew he was destined for something greater." Flashback. Michael, still a child, carrying a stack of books to the small local library, helping his peers with their homework, assisting Ruth in small household chores. His quiet strength and thoughtfulness made him extraordinary even then. though few recognized it. The room shifted. Some guests exchanged glances, curious whispers starting to ripple through the audience. "Who is she talking about?" one murmured. Another tilted their head, trying to guess, the tension now palpable. Ruth's voice softened, almost conspiratorial, yet it carried weight. "People often ask me why I worked so hard, why I sacrificed so much, and the answer is simple. This boy deserved a chance. He deserved the lessons I could give, the love I could offer, the foundation upon which he could build a life of purpose." Flashback. Ruth guiding Michael through a particularly difficult school project, teaching him patience as she explained each step. She knew that each moment, each lesson, each struggle would shape him into the man he was becoming. "Throughout his life," Ruth continued, "he carried my teachings with him. He applied them quietly, humbly, without seeking praise. But those of us who knew him, those who watched him grow, understood the extraordinary path he was taking. And tonight, I have the honor of speaking not just as a witness to his life, but as someone who had the privilege of guiding him from the very beginning." The audience leaned forward. The tension was now thick, almost tangible. Some held their breath. Others gripped their programs, their eyes fixed on Ruth. Every word she spoke was a thread pulling them closer to the revelation they were desperate to see. "And yet," Ruth said softly, a small smile forming, "many here tonight do not know him personally. Many only know his achievements, his reputation, his success. But I know the boy beneath it all. I know the heart, the soul, the man he has become, and soon you will too." Flashback. Young Michael at a school science fair, proudly presenting a project while Ruth stood in the back, unseen by the crowd, yet overflowing with pride. She had witnessed his perseverance, his brilliance, his kindness, the quiet power that would define him as an adult. The room was utterly silent. Every spectator was now caught in the suspense, hanging on Ruth's words, imagining this young boy who had grown into someone remarkable. Who was he? The answer, Ruth knew, would astonish them all. The audience begins to suspect. As Ruth continued speaking, a subtle shift rippled through the crowd. Eyes that had once been polite and polite expressions now tightened in curiosity. Whispers began to circulate, soft at first, like a breeze stirring the air. Something in her tone, her pauses, and the way she glanced at the audience suggested there was more, something significant, behind her story. "She's speaking about someone important, isn't she?" a guest murmured to their neighbor. Flashback. A young Michael, focused, diligent, polite, but already showing the quiet confidence and intelligence that would one day make him a leader. Ruth recounted small anecdotes, each one hinting at a life of exceptional achievement, but carefully avoiding names. Ruth smiled faintly, her eyes scanning the audience. "He has carried forward the lessons I taught him. Every challenge, every obstacle, every triumph, he faced them with the values I instilled." Suddenly, a woman near the front leaned forward. Could she be talking about Michael? "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling with curiosity. Another man in the audience whispered, "It has to be him. There's no one else it could be. Look at the way she's describing his childhood, his character. This is personal." The murmurs grew, spreading through the ballroom. Guests exchanged glances, their minds racing to connect the dots. Ruth's words, her presence, the intimate anecdotes, they were forming a puzzle, and slowly the pieces began to fit. Flashback. Ruth guiding Michael through his first big project at school, showing him how to navigate challenges while maintaining his integrity. Her narrative now painted a vivid picture of a boy who was exceptional, disciplined, and compassionate, the kind of person whose name the audience should recognize. She must be related to him," someone whispered, incredulous. Heads nodded subtly, a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization spreading across faces. Ruth paused, letting the tension settle like a drawn-out exhale. She knew that with each word, the audience was getting closer to understanding the truth. The subtle suspense she had woven into her story was working. The crowd was fully engaged, leaning in, waiting for the revelation that would leave them stunned. Some people shifted in their seats, curiosity overtaking etiquette. Others held their breath, hesitant to interrupt the moment, but unable to ignore the pull of the story unfolding before them. The room was alive with speculation, anticipation, and a growing sense of awe. Every anecdote Ruth shared, the quiet acts of courage, the moments of resilience, the lessons of compassion, now carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. The audience was no longer listening passively. They were piecing together the reality behind the story. The suspicion had taken hold. The murmurs, the glances, the barely contained excitement. It was clear that the crowd sensed something extraordinary, something that would soon change the tone of the evening forever. The revelation. She is Michael Carter's mother. Ruth inhaled deeply, letting the anticipation in the room stretch a heartbeat longer. Every eye was fixed on her, every ear strained to catch the next word. The murmurs had grown into a tense silence, as if the audience sensed the monumental truth about to be unveiled. "And tonight," Ruth said softly, her voice steady but charged with emotion, "I am honored to share this story not just as someone who has served this foundation for decades, but as a mother." She paused, letting the words settle. "I am Michael Carter's mother." A stunned hush swept over the ballroom. The glittering chandeliers reflected the collective shock on the faces of the audience. Whispers started to bubble up, disbelief mingled with awe. Heads turned toward each other, mouths opening and closing in silent exclamations. Flashback. Ruth watching Michael as a boy, guiding him through life's lessons with gentle authority, her love quiet but unwavering. Every sacrifice, every long hour of work, every moment of silent support, it all culminated in this revelation. Gasps echoed softly through the room. Some guests clutched their programs, unable to process the fact that the elegant, powerful CEO, whose name had dominated headlines for years, was the very boy Ruth had been recounting. Others stared, wide-eyed, at Ruth herself, the humble, unassuming woman who had spoken with such authority, yet seemed so ordinary moments ago. Ruth's voice carried over the room, steady and commanding, yet filled with warmth. "Yes," she continued, "the young boy I have spoken of, the one who learned resilience, compassion and integrity, is the man you know as Michael Carter, the CEO, the philanthropist, the man whose work has touched countless lives, is my son." The audience erupted, some with stunned applause, others simply sitting in awe, absorbing the magnitude of her words. Cameras flashed, phones lifted instinctively, capturing the moment when humility and greatness collided in one extraordinary revelation. Flashback. The small apartment kitchen, the late nights of homework and quiet guidance, the scraped knees and whispered encouragements, all of it suddenly made sense to the audience. The years of sacrifice had birthed not just a successful man, but a person of character, compassion and strength. Ruth smiled gently, looking out over the room. "I have spent a lifetime teaching him, guiding him, and sometimes letting him learn on his own. And now to see him here, accomplishing so much, carrying forward the values we hold dear, it is more than a mother could ever hope for." The crowd was silent once more, the gravity of the moment sinking in. For decades, Ruth had been unnoticed, her work behind the scenes. Tonight she stood as the embodiment of love, sacrifice and moral guidance. And the revelation that Michael Carter, a name known for power and prestige, was her son transformed every perception, every expectation, every whispered doubt in the room. Some guests wept quietly, others held their hands over their hearts. Ruth's story, and now her connection to the man whose achievements they revered, had made the evening unforgettable. The humble mother had become the centerpiece of a story that would echo far beyond the walls of the ballroom. Absolute silence in the ballroom. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The chandeliers glittered overhead, reflecting the stunned expressions on every face in the ballroom. The air was thick with disbelief, awe, and the weight of an unexpected truth. Ruth stood at the podium, calm, her posture composed, yet her eyes sparkled with the quiet pride of a lifetime of sacrifices recognized at last. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the soft clinking of glasses or the shuffle of programs against laps seemed to vanish, as though the entire room had collectively held its breath. The audience was suspended in a rare, shared moment of pure attention, hanging on every detail of Ruth's presence and the gravity of her revelation. Flashback, decades of quiet work, nights spent cleaning, organizing, and guiding her son, all unseen, all uncredited. These moments culminated in this single instant. The audience could feel it, though they didn't yet know the full depth of her influence. Her humility, her strength, her resilience, all of it resonated like a pulse throughout the room. Eyes widened. Some attendees held their hands to their mouths, struggling to contain gasps of astonishment. Others leaned forward, completely captivated, as if afraid that a single word from Ruth could shatter the fragile balance of disbelief they were teetering on. Cameras were poised mid-air, but even the shutter clicks seemed muted, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. The silence itself became part of the narrative, a living acknowledgement of the incredible story they had just heard. It wasn't just Ruth's words that held them, it was the truth behind them, the decades of unseen devotion, the quiet shaping of a life that had grown into greatness. Flashback, young Michael learning life lessons beside his mother, witnessing acts of courage, integrity, and selflessness, unaware that these early lessons would someday astonish the very people now in this glittering ballroom. Some guests' eyes glistened with tears, reflecting not only Ruth's journey, but also the universality of her struggle and triumph. Others simply stared, caught between admiration and disbelief, processing the humility of a woman whose life had been so impactful, yet so invisible for so long. Ruth, sensing the room's complete stillness, allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The silence was more than respect, it was recognition of a lifetime of perseverance, love, and moral guidance, recognition of a mother's unwavering dedication, now finally acknowledged in front of the world. And in that silence, the audience realized something profound. Greatness does not always announce itself with titles, flashy suits, or headlines. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, and steadfast, nurtured in the hearts of those who work tirelessly behind the scenes. And tonight Ruth had reminded them all of that truth, leaving the room suspended in reverent awe, waiting for what would come next. Emotional reactions. Some cry, others feel embarrassed. The moment Ruth revealed that she was Michael Carter's mother, the ballroom seemed to collectively exhale. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, a suspended breath of disbelief and awe. Then, the reactions began to ripple through the crowd, subtle at first, and then growing in intensity. Some guests wiped away tears, their hands trembling as the weight of the story sank in. The quiet, dignified woman at the podium had just unveiled a lifetime of sacrifice, love, and unseen guidance that had shaped one of the most powerful figures in the room. Tears streamed down faces, glinting in the chandelier light, a silent acknowledgement of the humility and grace Ruth embodied. Flashback, a young Michael struggling with homework, a scraped knee, or a moment of doubt, with Ruth beside him offering encouragement. The audience, moved by the small yet profound acts of everyday heroism, could now see the full magnitude of her influence. Others shifted in their seats, embarrassment coloring their expressions. Many had unconsciously underestimated Ruth, judging her by her role as a janitor, her modest attire, her quiet demeanor. The sudden revelation forced a confrontation with their own assumptions, a realization that greatness and influence often hide in plain sight. Soft murmurs of apology and awe passed through the room as people acknowledged the unfairness of their initial judgments. Some leaned closer to their neighbors, whispering incredulously, "I can't believe it. She's his mother. And all this time, I thought she was just a staff member and she raised him." Their voices trembled with admiration and a newfound respect. Flashback, Ruth at home, tirelessly guiding Michael through challenges, instilling values of resilience, compassion, and integrity. The audience now understood that every small act, every lesson, every sacrifice had culminated in the extraordinary man they admired from afar. There were moments of laughter too, gentle and nervous, as the audience recognized their own assumptions and social biases. Some guests chuckled quietly at the realization that their casual judgments had been so off base, a humbling and enlightening experience in itself. Ruth's serene expression reflected the mix of emotions in the room: pride, humility, and quiet satisfaction. She had shared her story without seeking recognition, yet the room's reaction was an affirmation of the decades of unseen love and guidance that had nurtured Michael into the man he had become. By the time Ruth paused, the room was filled with a tapestry of emotions: awe, respect, humility, joy, and empathy. The audience was no longer simply listeners, they were witnesses to a profound truth, emotionally moved by the story of a mother whose quiet sacrifices had shaped history in the making. In that ballroom, the impact of Ruth's life and legacy was undeniable. Hearts had been touched, minds humbled, and a simple act of storytelling had left an indelible mark on everyone present. Recognition, her importance in the CEO's life. Ruth's voice softened, yet it carried a profound authority that demanded attention. The audience, still processing the emotional storm of the previous revelation, leaned in instinctively. Every eye was fixed on her, as though the room itself recognized the weight of her words. Many of you know Michael Carter as a CEO, a philanthropist, a leader whose name appears in headlines and awards, Ruth began, but few realize the journey that shaped him, the lessons that guided him, and the values that formed the core of his character. Those lessons were my responsibility as his mother. A gentle murmur spread across the room, a mixture of awe and understanding. The audience was beginning to grasp the enormity of her role. Ruth's words painted a vivid picture, not just a woman cleaning floors or serving coffee, but a lifelong guide, mentor, and moral compass who had quietly molded a remarkable man. Flashback, scenes of young Michael struggling with his studies, with Ruth patiently guiding him through complex homework, patiently listening to his questions, encouraging curiosity and perseverance. Every late night, every small conversation, every lesson in integrity and kindness had become a building block for the extraordinary man he would become. Through every challenge he faced, Ruth continued, every triumph he achieved and every setback he endured, he carried the principles I instilled in him: integrity, compassion, resilience, humility, courage. These were not just words, but lessons lived every day, quietly, in the corners of our home, shaping a future leader before the world even noticed. Some guests nodded, their expressions softening with recognition. Others whispered among themselves, realizing that behind every headline, every public success, there had been decades of unseen guidance. Cameras shifted subtly, capturing not only Ruth's words, but the subtle way her presence had molded a legacy. And while the world applauds his professional achievements, Ruth added, her gaze steady, the foundation of his character is built on the values I nurtured. He is a reflection not just of his own intelligence and drive, but of the love, guidance, and sacrifices of those who quietly prepared him for greatness. I am proud and humbled to have played that role. Flashback. Michael facing critical business decisions, drawing on the lessons of patience, fairness, and empathy Ruth had instilled. Every choice, every action, every moment of leadership traced back to the careful shaping of his moral and emotional compass. The room absorbed the message in reverent silence. Ruth had not merely raised a son, she had cultivated a leader, a man whose success was inseparable from the wisdom, love, and resilience she had instilled from the very beginning. In that ballroom, the audience felt the quiet power of motherhood, mentorship, and unwavering dedication, and they recognized fully that behind every great man stood an extraordinary woman whose influence could not be measured by wealth or status alone. Closing with morale, respect the invisible, value wisdom, family. As Ruth stepped back from the podium, the room remained in hushed reverence. The story had unfolded before their eyes, a tale of dedication, sacrifice, and love that had quietly shaped one of the most successful men in the country. But beyond the awe of revelation, Ruth's words carried a deeper lesson, one that transcended the glittering chandeliers and the elegant gowns of the ballroom. "Tonight," Ruth said softly, "I hope my story reminds us all of the value in the invisible, the people whose work, love, and guidance often go unnoticed, yet are the pillars upon which great achievements are built." A ripple of understanding passed through the audience. They had witnessed humility, patience, and resilience personified in Ruth, and they realized that respect for the unseen contributions of others is not merely courtesy, it is wisdom. The applause that began to swell was tentative at first, then grew, filled with sincerity and admiration, acknowledging the quiet heroes of life. Flashback. Ruth scrubbing floors after long shifts, managing household challenges, and raising Michael with unwavering care. These ordinary moments had crafted extraordinary outcomes. It was a reminder that greatness is rarely instantaneous or flashy. It is often cultivated in quiet, persistent acts of love and diligence. And let us not forget, Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction, the power of family. The values we teach, the support we give, and the love we show can shape lives in ways that ripple far beyond what we can see. Michael's success is, in truth, a reflection of these very principles: resilience, integrity, and the strength that comes from a family that believes in one another. Some guests dabbed at their eyes, moved by the authenticity of her words. Others leaned toward one another, nodding in agreement, reflecting on the often unseen influence of their own families, mentors, and loved ones. Ruth's story had ignited empathy, introspection, and a renewed respect for the quiet, guiding forces in life. Flashback. The lessons of integrity, kindness, and patience Ruth had passed on, moments that seemed small at the time, but had become the foundation of Michael's character. The audience now understood that every headline, Every achievement, every public accolade had been built upon decades of invisible work and unwavering devotion. Respect those who work behind the scenes, Ruth concluded, her eyes scanning the room with gentle authority. Honor wisdom wherever it appears, and cherish your family, for they are the architects of our character, the bearers of our values, and the true measure of success in life. The room erupted in heartfelt applause. The gala, initially a showcase of wealth and status, had transformed into a celebration of love, humility, and human dignity. Ruth's story, of sacrifice, wisdom, and family, had left an indelible mark, a moral that would linger long after the lights dimmed and the guests departed. In that moment, the audience understood. The invisible often carries the greatest power, and the quiet acts of love shape the world more profoundly than any spotlight ever could. Emotional closing, lasting impact, and final lesson. As the applause began to settle, Ruth allowed herself a gentle smile. The room, once filled with chatter and polite social etiquette, now carried a palpable sense of awe and introspection. Guests lingered in their seats, hesitant to break the moment, fully aware that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a story of humility, perseverance, and love that transcended wealth, status, and appearances. "Tonight," Ruth said softly, "we have seen how one person's quiet dedication can shape the course of another's life. Michael Carter's achievements are widely celebrated, but the foundation of his character, the values that guide him, and the courage he exhibits every day were nurtured long before the world knew his name." The audience listened intently, some eyes glistening with tears, others reflecting deeply on their own lives. The story was more than a tale of success. It was a reminder of the invisible forces that sustain, guide, and protect us. It was a call to honor the unseen, the mentors, the caregivers, the parents, and the individuals whose labor, love, and wisdom form the bedrock of achievement. Flashback. Michael as a young boy, learning resilience, patience, and integrity at his mother's side. The audience could now visualize the countless hours, the small acts of sacrifice, and the unconditional support that had shaped the man they knew as a CEO and philanthropist. Every decision, every success, every act of kindness he displayed traced back to Ruth's guidance and love. "Let us carry forward this lesson," Ruth continued, her voice gaining quiet strength. "Respect those who work behind the scenes. Value wisdom, no matter the age or appearance of the person who offers it. Cherish your family and your loved ones, for they are the ones who mold our hearts, teach us courage, and give us the foundation to face life's challenges with integrity." Some guests wiped their eyes, others leaned closer to friends or colleagues, sharing quiet affirmations. The grandeur of the gala, the opulence of the setting, and the prestige of the attendees all faded in comparison to the profound human truth Ruth had shared. The power of invisible dedication, quiet love, and steadfast guidance resonated far more deeply than any award or headline ever could. As Ruth stepped down from the podium, the audience erupted in heartfelt, sustained applause. Cameras flashed, capturing not only her presence, but the collective realization that greatness often emerges from humility and love. The story lingered in every mind, leaving a lasting impression. The most significant impact in life is often invisible, subtle, and quietly transformative. Ruth's tale, and the extraordinary revelation of her role in shaping Michael Carter, would echo long after the gala ended. Guests left the ballroom not just entertained or impressed, but moved, inspired, and reminded of a timeless truth. True greatness is nurtured through compassion, dedication, and the unwavering strength of those who work quietly to shape the world around them. In that moment, the audience understood. The invisible is often the most powerful, and the lessons of love, wisdom, and family are the ones that endure. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more, like the video, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below. I'd love to know, on a scale from 0 to 10, what score would you give this story? Your feedback means a lot.